Today, we're going to be covering a movie that's a little bit different. For as much as it was influenced by its namesake, LA Noire also draws from war films, and there were certainly a lot of them coming out in the decade and a half after World War II ended. That's why, today, I'm covering a classic yet often overlooked war drama called To Hell and Back. The story about the story. So, I brought up the film Sergeant York a couple of times, and I may have mentioned that it was a film created during World War II about a Tennessee sniper who, in a World War I battle, shot so many Germans in a machine gun nest that over 100 men surrendered. But one thing I didn't mention was that this movie was based on a real-life person. In fact, that's the case more often than not when it comes to war movies. Everything from The Great Escape to the bridge on the River Kwai was based on real-life events, although how directly they were based varies significantly from one film to the next. For instance, the POW camp breakout, which The Great Escape was based on, was a real event, but most of the cast was fictionalized, and the fact that Americans were involved at all in the British escape was, for the most part, a Hollywood addition. Bridge on the River Kwai, meanwhile, is almost entirely fiction. Allied POWs were forced by the Japanese to build a bridge over a river in occupied Thailand, but the prisoners were treated like absolute dog shit by the Japanese since they were currently high on that whole warrior culture nonsense, and, like POW laborers the world round, they did everything they could to sabotage the Japanese efforts. Also, thousands of POWs died in the process, along with tens of thousands of conscripted civilian laborers. Today's movie is more on the honest side of things, or at least as honest as you could expect from 1955. Like Sergeant York, To Hell and Back centers around a highly decorated American soldier, Audie Murphy, and it's based on that man's autobiography, which bears the same name. Also, the film's star is Audie Murphy. The movie isn't any sort of vanity project, by the way, and Murphy wasn't a case of stunt casting. Following his return from Europe, Murphy was discovered by James Cagney when he saw him on the cover of Life magazine. Cagney trained Murphy in acting for 2 years, and although the two would part ways in 1947, Murphy kept up his training even as he worked with a writer to produce his autobiography, which was published in 1949. That same year, he got his first leading role thanks to the king of Poverty Row, Allied artists, along with some help provided by patriotic theater owners in Texas. After that, Murphy got picked up by Universal Studios and got starring roles in a long string of films, mostly war movies and westerns for fairly obvious reasons. By 1955, his filmography was a dozen movies deep, and when Universal decided to adapt his story, Murphy initially declined the lead role and suggested a different actor. But he was eventually convinced, and the film would go on to become Universal's biggest hit up to that point. And as for why Audie Murphy would have wanted to avoid playing himself in the movie, it wasn't just because he was 10 years older. Hopefully you'll understand what I'm getting at by the time we finish the story. Once the opening credits end, we meet General Walter Bedell Smith, a retired Army general who acts as our narrator and informs us that this movie is not going to be about a major battle or a big wartime event. It's going to be about the grunts, about the life and times of the foot soldiers who filled the ranks and dealt with the hardships of war. He also mentions that our subject today, Audie Murphy, is the single most decorated soldier for combat action in the history of the United States. The story begins with Audie at 12 years old, a kid in northeast Texas who was already skilled with a rifle since he had to hunt game to help feed his large family. His father abandoned them some time ago, although the film tiptoes around that point. But at the same time, Audie has to go to his neighbor, Mr. Houston, to ask for a full-time job. Mrs. Houston argues against the point and says his older sister should help them out, but she's already helping as best she can considering she has a family of her own. Eventually, Mr. Houston agrees, and so we hear some disconcertingly jaunty music as a 12-year-old boy quits school to work for a living in order to support his family. Several years pass, and the real Audie Murphy appears. His mother is sick, dying in fact, and when he stops by the Houston home, he hears about the Pearl Harbor attack. Later, in 1942, his mother dies, and his siblings are placed in a public institution since he's too young to act as their guardian. With nothing to tie him down anymore, Audie talks to Mr. Houston about joining the military. Audie will have to get a letter of permission since he's underage, but Houston is willing to give him one. By the way, Houston's character has been nothing but an extended advertisement for the armed forces, constantly talking about getting marketable skills and a decent pension. Also, in real life, Audie lied about his age to join the army, and his first attempt to join was right after Pearl Harbor, since, in reality, his mother was already dead by then. Anyway, back with movie Audie, he gets rejected by every branch of the armed services until the army decides to take him. We then spend a little time with Audie on the ship to North Africa, where he gets extremely seasick. On shore, we see that Audie is joining the 3rd Infantry Division, 15th Regiment, Baker Company, 3rd Platoon. As you might expect, the older, more experienced soldiers don't make much of the short and young Audie. That evening, we get to know some of the men of 3rd Platoon. Kovac is a Polish immigrant studying for his citizenship test. He's also one of the few soldiers to hang onto his stove, which he shares with a quiet Native American who smokes cigars and goes by Chief. Johnson is a womanizer who loves telling tales about all the ladies he's known. Kerrigan is a friendly guy who tells awkward jokes and gives Murphy the nickname Little Texas. Valentino is a half Italian American. Brandon is a divorced father who takes Murphy under his wing. One day, the company commander calls Murphy into his tent and goes over his record. He was sick for a week following his inoculations. He was sick the whole trip across the Atlantic, and when he requested to join the paratroopers, he was turned down for physical deficiencies. The captain wants to transfer him out of the rifle unit, but Murphy insists on sticking with combat duty. Reluctantly, the captain allows him to stay, and then points out to his lieutenant that Murphy also signed up for every education course the Army offered and has been spending his pay on war bonds for his family. Later still, Murphy returns to Casablanca after vacationing in Alaska and spends a night out with his unit, dancing with a woman who goes by Cleopatra. A French announcer interrupts the radio broadcast, and suddenly all the French speakers in the room start cheering. The Germans have surrendered in Tunisia, which means the African continent now belongs to the Allies. One of the men talks about going home without seeing any combat, but of course, they're getting shipped off to Sicily instead. As the men wait to hit the beach in the landing craft, Valentino starts talking about visiting Naples, a major city in southern Italy. His mother's family still live there, and she asked him to check up on them if he ends up in the area. The landing itself turns out to be quite easy and entirely made up of stock footage, but as the platoon advances into the hills of Sicily, a German machine gun opens up on them, killing the lieutenant. Murphy, Brennan, and Johnson go with the sergeant to check out the German position, but the sergeant gets hit when he tries to go back to inform the rest of the platoon. In response, the 3 of them advance on the machine gun, toss in some grenades, and then shoot some German reinforcements as they crest the nearby hill. In the process, Brandon takes some very foolish risks. The general from earlier comes back to explain that Sicily fell 38 days later, but that this didn't really mean much to the foot soldier, who only knew that he always had to march to a new position. Back at the 3rd Platoon camp, Lieutenant Manning shows up to replace the dead one, and at the same time, Murphy gets promoted to corporal. He's not sure why he got promoted, but he doesn't get a say in the matter. Next, we're in Italy, where the 3rd Platoon passes a line of wounded and exhausted British troops who are leaving the front lines. They advance up to the Volturno River, located just north of Naples, where the Germans have destroyed all the bridges. And although the shore is quiet, it's obvious the Germans are hiding on the other side. After dark, the 15th Regiment reach the riverbank and start digging in. They also find out, much to their chagrin, that they get to be the diversion, and Murphy's Baker Company will be starting things off. Murphy and Brandon have a quiet talk about Brandon's home and his ex-wife, how maybe he should try to patch things up if he gets home again. For his part, Murphy is thinking of going career. Their talk is interrupted by Sergeant Klasky, who wants Murphy's squad to sneak across the river and stir things up. On his way over, Murphy tells Brandon to head to the command post. He and his men then swim across the river, open up on some Germans, and then flee back to their side as a machine gun covers their retreat. When Murphy gets back on shore, Brandon complains that he was left behind because he was getting sentimental, but Murphy tells him that it's because he takes too many chances. The next morning, the 15th Division opens up and starts getting hammered by German artillery. Sergeant Klasky dies in the bombardment, and Lieutenant Manning gets hit, so Murphy gets command of the platoon for being the first corporal to reach the radio. At this point, though, there's not much to do aside from lead the platoon across the river once the artillery shells stop raining down. The narrator returns again to tell us that the 3rd Division advanced up the peninsula, only to stall out at Cassino, a small town in the mountains between Naples and Anzio. Everything is rainy, muddy, and miserable, and tempers are flaring. On the bright side, though, Lieutenant Manning finally gets back, and the company is heading back to Naples for some leave. Manning also promotes Murphy to sergeant and Johnson to corporal. In Naples, the soldiers enjoy the local sights and the local ladies, and Valentino heads off to find his family, bringing them a spare set of boots as a gift. The rest of the men get hassled by some war orphans who are asking for cigarettes, chocolate, and other handouts. However, one of the kids is too proud to take the chocolate. Johnson, Murphy, and Brandon all go to a local bar and discover that the women are hanging out with the Army Air Force men, since they're stationed in Naples. The infantrymen get together and sing an insulting song. Then they start a bar fight that gets broken up by the military police. They get out of it by blaming everything on the poor, confused bar owner, and although it's a pretty obvious excuse, the MPs let them off with a warning. Murphy heads out and spots that proud boy from earlier shining boots, so he gets his boots shined, and tries to hand him the chocolate as payment, but his older sister stops him, saying, "There is no begging here." However, she does say that they can share their meal with him, and that he can then share his chocolate with them. Murphy goes and eats at their house, although the mother insists on no English spoken at the dinner table. Unfortunately, the meal is interrupted by air raid sirens. Meanwhile, Johnson goes with a native girl back to her place, but it's only to talk about his real girlfriend. Turns out he makes up all his stories about women since his buddies would otherwise feel obligated to make fun of his girl. Also, Kerrigan gets his boots stolen by another woman. When we cut back to Murphy, he and the girl he met are alone, since the rest of her family fled to a bomb shelter, and the two of them embrace. She explains that the reason her mother doesn't like English is because the English killed her older brother in Africa. She doesn't hold a personal grudge, but she also doesn't like the reminder. It's then implied that the two of them have sex, mostly from the look of satisfaction Murphy has when he gets on the troop transport the next day. Back on the front lines, the 3rd Division takes part in an amphibious assault on Anzio, a city halfway between Naples and Rome. There they get bogged down by 5 German divisions who might otherwise have repelled the invasion of Normandy. Down in the trenches, we see Johnson's squad fleeing a farmhouse, the only standing building for miles, while at the same time 3 replacement soldiers join the platoon. Murphy covers the squad's retreat, but another new soldier panics and gets shot as he tries to flee. The farmhouse has traded hands 11 times already, but it's so important as an observation post that they're going to have to take it back again. More men get shot in the assault, but when Johnson feels something hit him, it turns out it took out his can of beans. Murphy leads a successful charge into the building, but not before both Lieutenant Manning and Private Kovac die to machine gun fire. Soon afterwards, a line of German tanks approach, but the artillery lieutenant sets up just in time to direct fire and destroy one of the tank treads, paralyzing the advance since the fields are too muddy for tanks to cross. That evening, one of the newbies comes in with Kovac's stove. Chief angrily grabs it from him and buries it out in the yard, still saying nothing but obviously in anguish. Murphy then hears the Germans trying to repair the busted tank, and when he brushes off the newbies on his way out, Johnson explains to them that experienced soldiers don't like to make friends, because then it hurts a bit less when they see their fellow soldiers die. Murphy leads a successful assault on the tank, and the next morning, Captain Marks shows up to ask Murphy to take a battlefield commission, a promotion to second lieutenant. Murphy doesn't think he's qualified though, and he doesn't want to transfer out of the platoon, but the argument is interrupted when the Germans start advancing across the drying fields. The platoon retreats away from the farmhouse, but in the process, Johnson gets hit for real and dies. 4 months into the fighting at Anzio, an armored division finally lands and the Allies successfully push through to Rome. There, 3rd Platoon gets word that they're getting more amphibious training for a landing in southern France. And once there, they get ambushed again by German machine guns. This time the chief gets one in the leg, which means he'll be going home. Brandon leads a patrol to scout the position, but when half his men take bullets, Murphy heads up to see what's going on. The 2 men head up to try and flank the nest, but Brandon dies when he jumps out of cover too soon. In response, Murphy grabs a machine gun from the one nest they cleared and just murders everybody. He then spends a moment to mourn his fallen friend. Later on, the battalion commander offers Murphy a battlefield commission again, along with a spot at West Point Academy and a promise not to transfer him, and this time he accepts. Murphy gets back to his unit just as they prepare to attack an observation post, along with 2 tanks. They manage to destroy the post, but not before Kerrigan gets hit in the arm by German shrapnel. Finally, Murphy's company advances on Holzwehr, a town on the French side of the German border, and thanks to German artillery fire, their flanks are exposed during a German advance. Murphy orders a retreat, but he stays behind to personally direct artillery fire into the German ranks. As they continue to advance, Murphy climbs onto a burning Sherman tank, which in real life was a burning M10 tank destroyer, and fires its machine gun even after being wounded until the Germans are forced to turn back. I feel I should add, by the way, that Murphy's actions on this day were actively toned down from what he did in real life. Specifically, he fired that machine gun for a fucking hour straight until it ran out of ammunition in the bitter cold of January 1945. And then he continued to advance with his platoon after a medic quickly patched up his leg. Anyway, we catch up with Movie Murphy in the hospital, where he talks with a still recovering Kerrigan about how his wound has disqualified him from further active military service, although he does at least get a promotion to first lieutenant. The film ends with Audie Murphy getting his Medal of Honor and remembering all his fallen friends during a military parade. Final thoughts. Oh, gather round me, comrades, and listen while I speak of a war, a war, a war where hell is 6 feet deep. Along the shore the cannons roar. Oh, how can a soldier sleep? The going's slow on Anzio, and hell is 6 feet deep. Praise be to God for this captured sod that rich with blood does seep, with yours and mine like butchered swines, and hell is 6 feet deep. That death awaits there's no debate, no triumph will we reap. The crosses grow on Anzio, where hell is 6 feet deep. The Crosses Grow on Anzio, written by Audie Murphy in 1948. He wrote it for his autobiography, although the text attributes it to one of his friends. In the 1960s, when Vietnam War veterans first began to speak publicly about post-traumatic stress disorder, Murphy was one of the World War II vets who stepped forward and said, no, these people are not just complaining, and they aren't all wimps. PTSD is a problem that affects soldiers of every generation, and we need a better way of treating it than morphine and addictive sleeping pills. Both aspects of the issue were intimately familiar to Murphy, who had spent so much of World War II on the front lines. He suffered from insomnia, nightmares, and depression after he got home, and apparently he once broke down in tears while watching a documentary about German war orphans. He was also prone to bouts of anger, even before he joined the army, and his PTSD did not help matters one bit. The VA doctors treated his symptoms with Placidil, a sleeping drug, and in the mid-60s, he realized that he had become addicted. So, he locked himself in a hotel room for a week to get clean. In 1971, Audie Murphy died in a plane crash, and he was subsequently buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His is the second most visited grave in the cemetery, right behind the grave of JFK. They had to put in a special paved walkway to accommodate all the visitors. You can even get right up next to the gravestone on Google Maps. As a band Sabaton once said in their 2014 song To Hell and Back, a song which incorporates much of Murphy's own poetry, "If there be any glory in war, let it rest on men like him." Thanks for joining me again for today's film review. I hope you'll join me next time for an example of how Fritz Lang helped define all the noir genre cliches.